Well, thank you for coming to What We Gon' Do. We're doing a special episode to kind of be responsive to recent events and really delve into the obvious history. If you didn't know, you should know now that there is a history in this country of anti-Asian racist sentiment and violence that connects us to what's going on in the present. And I want to kind of go into that, how leaders are stepping up, how you are personally reacting to things like the murders in Atlanta, and kind of just like this raising, horrifying sentiment that we're seeing. And then how this can be really used as a moment for solidarity, not just between kind of Black people and the API community, but all people of color, everyone who is against white supremacy, which is really the root cause that we're all dealing with. And kind of these internecine battles is exactly what a white supremacist wants, As long as we're fighting, we can't unify and, destroy kind of what the actual root of all these problems are. So I'm your host, Trey Borden, obviously. And before we get started, why don't we just kind of go around and give a small introduction? Let's start with Callie.
Great. Happy to be here. My name's Callie Chamberlain. I work, do you want me to say where I work or where I live?
You can say where you're based. Yeah. You say what you're comfortable sharing.
Great. I am a Korean transracial adoptee, and I'm based in Minneapolis, Minnesota.
Thank you for coming. Mai, you want to go next?
Yeah. Trey, thank you so much for having me on your show. Really appreciate you holding space and really uplifting Asian women to be able to tell our stories and share what's been happening on the ground. My name is Mai Vang, and proud Sacramentan, daughter of Hmong refugees, and currently the Sacramento City Council member for District 8. I represent the southern part of Sacramento. That's South Sac, so the heart of South Sac.
916 representing. And am I wrong in saying, Mai, you're the first Hmong representative on the council?
Yeah, the first Asian woman on the city council.
Wow.
I know, we're in 2021.
Right on time, Okay, great. And last but not least, An?
Hi, I'm An Lee Jordan. I'm a transplant to Raleigh, North Carolina, and I'm a Vietnamese refugee, came over when Saigon fell in 1975, and primarily have lived in very white spaces for most of my growing up years before I moved to New York City.
Right. I mean, it is funny because you think of certain places like Raleigh or the South or Texas as being where all the racism is. And what we're seeing is that it is everywhere. And there's no place that's kind of a safe space where one is kind of shielded from this type of violence and sentiment. So I guess, I wanted to kind of check in with you about how each of you are kind of feeling. I think that this has been quite a year, in a variety of ways. We have dealt with conceivably every possible human issue and kind of a terrestrial issue that we could possibly deal with. But I think that, the lingering results of Trumpism, which is kind of this emboldenedness for people who, have hate, who maybe see in some way the decline of white supremacy as a threat and something that they need to mobilize around. It seems like these people are busier than ever, as we saw on the 6th, and as I'm afraid we're going to continue to see for quite some time. And so kind of, how are you guys all? I mean, I want to get into kind of like what your experience has been kind of as members of the API community, but kind of just doing a check-in, like how are we? Whoever would like to start. Mai, you want to go?
Yeah. One of the word that I've been using to describe just this moment or moment when the incident happened in Atlanta is unbearable, right? I think just as the daughter of a Hmong refugee growing up in poverty, like I saw firsthand already living alongside Black Latinos, how the system was really did not work for us, right? And, I just want to relay, anti-Asian xenophobia and hate isn't something that's new. If anything, the incident that happened last week was just triggering for many of us. Again, like the word I've been using is just unbearable. I've been in this space where I'm just responding to folks right now and haven't really had time to just sit with it really and do more reflection, because it's been just answering calls, holding space for folks that is feeling so much hurt and trauma. I mean, it wasn't just the Atlanta incident. But even prior to that, there was an increase in anti-Asian incident, even locally here in Sacramento, where we saw a mutilated cat left in front of a Chinese-owned business, where we had an educator in the heart of North Sacramento perpetuating stereotypes of Asian, showing her eyes of what she thought Chinese or Japanese folks look like, right? And this is happening in a Zoom class, right? And so these incident that's happening now isn't something that's new, but you're absolutely right, Trey, that, we had a previous administration that did absolutely embolden a segment of America to attack Asian Americans. But as you know, there is a long and painful history, a racist history in this country. And I know we'll probably get some time to go through that. So
certainly. I had not heard about those incidents in Sacramento. I mean, God, people really know how to disappoint you. That's one thing that I've learned this last year is like they're really innovative with their ways of disappointing you when you least expect it. Do you want to kind of do a check-in about how you've been interpreting this?
Sure. I kind of echo a lot of what Mai said, and I think I would use the term maybe emotional whiplash. I felt so obviously saddened after George Floyd, but the conversations that it actually led in Asian communities about being allies and how we need to speak up and not just be silent anymore gave me so much heart for the Asian community. And I was so proud that so many people were having conversations with different generations of Asian Americans that never happened before. There was just kind of a silent acquiescence and, you know what, that they're from another generation, we'll just leave them be and let them spew their racist hate, even though we're also the subject of the same racism. And it was such a fruitful endeavor. And then yet at the same time, then all of this happens. And for there to be kind of a push and pull back with Asians having risen up to try to show solidarity and not to have as much in kind really kind of hurt. And then similarly, whiplash culturally on a broader level also, just, I had spent the weekend we watched with my family the new Disney movie with Kelly Marie Tran as
I Am the Last Dragon. I saw that yesterday.
Yeah, and it was like
not in research, but I did watch it.
Well, I mean, I burst into tears the first time that Kelly called her dad Ba, which is dad in Vietnamese. And I literally, my sister and I, we were watching together apart, and we're both texting each other like, oh my God, we've never heard that before, let alone in a Disney production, not like some sort of indie Viet film. And so, like the nominations for Minari, and it's just like this excitement. And then Tuesday comes along and it's just like, oh no, it's up 2 steps forward, 3 steps back. I don't know. So it's been real emotional whiplash of a lot to celebrate. And I don't want to lose that, but at the same time, also a lot of sorrow.
Absolutely. And I think that was that was what made the week so ridiculous. It's like you have, Nova and Chloe Zhang, and you have like Rez and Steven kind of being the first Asian men going to be nominated. You're like, yay, progress. And then like Atlanta happens. You're like, almost like, what does it even mean that we have these Academy Award nominations, that this is still kind of like the risk we're running in this country? So yeah, we'll kind of dive into that. Callie, how you doing?
Yeah, I mean, so many great words have already been used. It's really confronting. It's devastating. I mean, I was sort of laughing when you set it up, but it's like, there really is no bottom to this pit. Like, we just keep falling and it just seemingly gets worse. And I don't know how. But I mean, I'm in Minneapolis. Like, I live right next to the government center. There are protests every day outside of my house. You will probably hear helicopters. Everything is boarded up. The Chauvin trial is starting on Monday. We've been in jury selection last month. Like, all of last summer, we were mobilizing and organizing and protesting and trying to work together across organizations that represent the communities of color that exist here. And it is just like another thing. And I think part of what has been super challenging for me personally is I sort of introed with saying that I'm a transracial adoptee. And what that means is that I was born in Korea. I have a biological family there that I'm not in contact with. And then I was raised by white people in Minnesota. So my family is white. My community growing up was white. I literally didn't even learn what racism was until I was 23 living in New York City. And then I can very clearly remember developing a language around it and thinking, oh my God, I have to rethink everything that has happened to me up until this point, because I didn't even realize that this is not a Cali problem. This is a racism problem. Like, this is a shared experience that actually Hmong women that I lived with in New York City, we're all talking about the same things. And that simultaneously makes me so sad. And it also makes me feel relieved that it's not just me in some ways, because I just didn't know. And so it's all of those types of feelings, and I can get into a little bit more about my relationship to the Asian community and other transracial adoptees. But it's just, I mean, what does that even matter when people look at you and there is no like individualism, there's just a monolith. And so I represent a virus to them. I represent an immigrant. I represent all these things that, you know, my lived experience doesn't necessarily mirror, but doesn't really matter in the context of this conversation.
Well, I mean, yeah, and you guys have sorry, were you going to say something, Maya?
Yeah, I was just going to say, Callie, you're so on point. Like, when you talk about the monolith, right, as being viewed as a monolithic group, right? I think even now, like, there continues to be harmful and inaccurate narratives that paint Asian American and Asian immigrant community as a monolithic group, like you mentioned, as the model minority. And oftentimes that truly erase the racism that we face. And as you know, Trey, just a quick one-on-one, model minority myth is really a coin, I would argue, that, you know, erases anti-Asian racism and violence in our community, because what it does is it pits community against each other. And let me also be clear that the model minority myth or stereotype was coined specifically and purposefully to really divide us and keep other communities down, in particular, the Black community. And this is how white supremacy works, right? And the model minority has never helped Asian Americans. If anything, it's been a tool for white supremacy. I mean, it masks the disparities within Asian American Pacific Islander. I mean, Asian Americans have the largest wealth gap when you disaggregate data. And what ends up happening is that because of this myth, you know, as a result, you know, the harm and trauma we experience is not addressed or covered by mainstream media. And so there is a danger in the myth in itself. So Callie's absolutely right about Asian Americans being seen as a monolithic group when we're incredibly diverse. We speak multiple languages. Our cultures are incredibly different, but we are united in terms of that Asian American identity. And that term was coined really as a political movement in terms of unity and solidarity among Asian Americans, right? That there is power in our numbers, but also to recognize that we definitely do have a very complex and diverse community.
Yeah, and just to underline one point that you made, sorry, Trey, really quickly, is just, like, we can't forget that the model minority myth was literally created to denigrate the Black community. Mm-hmm. So that is its intent. We are used as a racial wedge. If you look at immigration policies, they being the US government, recruited highly educated East Asians to come to this country. This is all strategic. And honestly, you look at it, you learn about it, you're sort of like, God damn, who were these people that were really thinking that far ahead to be able to be this thoughtful? But clearly it continues to work. So it's really important that we name that, to your point, that there's a shared oppressor here, which is supremacy, that has the power to harm all of us, including white people. And that, you know, really seeing Asian, you know, like pitted against Black is just, it's not the point.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Or it is the point, right? Like, I think that it's so, I mean, first of all, the diversity, even among the three of you, in terms of your experience, kind of where you even live geographically, where you've come from and how, I mean, if there's this much diversity just with kind of this three people, I mean, it's so harmful and dehumanizing to kind of say everyone is one thing, and it's ignorant. And I think that it is diabolical. I mean, sometimes you're like, it's not all toothless yokels, you know, who can't find Vietnam on a map. This is like a very, very long-term, ingrained, you know, kind of, I mean, I don't want to say smart, but it was well executed in its approach to kind of divide communities of color. And, you know, the reason for that obviously is because if we looked to our left and right and saw brothers and sisters in the struggle, they wouldn't have a chance. So like, this is something that they know that they had to do if they were going to kind of be as successful as they've been. I kind of want to get into some of your personal experiences in this country. Callie, you said that you kind of, growing up in this white environment and kind of already having some sort of disconnect with your kind of ethnic heritage. What have your experiences been with, racism, like in your personal life here?
Yeah. I mean, I will be honest, obviously. I mean, growing up, I had so much internalized white supremacy. And I remember being like 6 or 7 and asking my mom for blonde hair and blue eyes for Christmas. I just really wanted to be white. I really wanted to be, somebody who could fit in. And being one of the only people of color you grow up without any racial mirrors. You don't see yourself reflected anywhere. And it's really interesting to see already a society's progression, right? Where we talk about representation. I can now go to Sephora and find makeup that is my skin color. That was not the case even, however many years ago. That was not that long. I'm not that old.
There was no Fenty.
Yeah, there was no Fenty. Exactly. Thank you, Rihanna. So it just, it was really challenging. And I remember being picked on, and I remember one specific example of some boy, a couple stories above where I was, and he dropped a bunch of change and was like, "Oh, ching chong jink." And I remember thinking, he's talking to me. I didn't even really know because my parents weren't talking to me about racism. They had never had personal experiences with it. And so it was just sort of trying to figure out how to navigate all of this on my own, and seeing other, white people that had these feelings toward me. And again, I internalized that. I wanted to be like them. And I didn't know that it wasn't about me. It was about the color of my skin. And then getting older, it turned into much more sexualized type of racism and fetishization that was scary, and also not as much of people trying to use terms that I'd heard growing up, but just a different type of fear that it instilled within me. And so those have been really a lot of my experiences, is seeing that transition across time, but never, for as much as I didn't understand my racial identity, having that ever be something that other people didn't understand and treat me accordingly.
Right. They saw you as, whatever they saw you as, even if you didn't.
Right.
Anna, I know you spend a lot of time in the South, which is a place where one might expect to deal with more overt sources of racism, but I'm sure that it runs the gamut. Can you talk a little bit about your experiences?
Sure. I have a similar experience to Callie in terms of my youth. I grew up in Lansing, Michigan, which is where the family that sponsored my family when we came from Vietnam, they were from. A very nice white Lutheran family. And so I was in Lansing, Michigan, and then we moved to Buffalo, New York. So that's where I grew up. And it was white also. So my sister and I were the 2 Asians, not even the 2 Vietnamese people, the 2 Asians in the school district. The school district, not the school. And I think, one of the 2 of the moments I wanted to highlight was just one, kind of a sweet innocence when my family became naturalized. I got naturalized because I was born in Vietnam. And my parents were really intent on me changing my name, right? Instead of An, they wanted me to change it to Ann, so that I could just assimilate and be American and fit in and all that good stuff, because they knew the struggle was going to be real for me. And I refused. I specifically put my hands on my hips and was like, how will people know I'm Vietnamese then? I was 7 years old. I knew that, right? But at the same
that's the
time,
point.
I think about the sweet and innocence of myself and how my parents were trying to protect me. But then I don't know how I had that innocence, because I remember also very distinctly my first time of feeling other was being in kindergarten. I had learned how to read at a young age. English is pretty much my first language. And I showed up to kindergarten. I knew how to read. My English was fluent. And these people put me on a bus that was an ESL bus in that first month of school because of how I looked. So I remember very distinctly sitting on a bus next to Cindy Lee, who did not speak a lick of English, and being like, "We're in the same place? Why?" "Oh, I know why. Look around the bus." And I remember feeling like I was in a horror movie, I don't belong here. Do you guys see me? I know 3-syllable words. I can spell. And it was my first time being like, oh, people are going to see me not for who I am, but just for who they see. And obviously I was 5. I had not that complex of thoughts on it, but it was the first time, right? And, like Kelly said, in reflecting back, I look at all of my internalized racism and internalized white supremacy, because once things like that happen, you just kind of want to fit in. It's hard to be the bump in the road that every time someone passes, they hit you and hit you and hit you. You learn how to make yourself small so it's a smoother ride, right? And it wasn't until I went to college, I went to Cornell, and I showed up at Cornell.
Yeah, you love that upstate.
Yeah, I know. I showed up at Cornell and I was like, oh, there are a lot of Asian people here, but there's different flavors of Asian. There's like international student Asian, there's super proud Asian, there's trying to pass as white Asian, there's white proximity Asian. And I was like, I don't know who I am. It was my first time being confronted with that. And it's been a journey since then of trying to figure out what my identity was. And I did labor relations for 5 years. That's what I studied in undergrad, and that's what I did. So I was in a very old white man industry. And so I had a really hard time even understanding how all of my oppression was conflated from people being like, oh, you're young and you're a woman and you're Chinese. I'm actually not Chinese, but okay. And all of those things, it was hard for me to understand what people had against me, except they just knew I was very, very, very different. And so I never even really got to exploring the Asian aspect of it, as opposed to just trying to be a woman in labor relations, just trying to be young in labor relations, as well as being a person of color in labor relations. So it's been a real long journey for me that I'm still working on today, honestly, as a 46-year-old woman.
Right. I mean, it's a lifelong struggle. And I think as someone who, it's interesting hearing your experiences. And like, I went to school with predominantly white kids. I mean, my parents did a lot of work to make sure I, had a social life that was very Black, but this stuff just seeps into you, and like, you don't even really, it's taken me a long time. It's funny that it just seems I've had so many conversations just like this with Black people or with, other minority groups. And that's what's so universal about this experience, especially if you're constantly faced with this othering, I know that you've had a very different experience in terms of your consciousness about your culture and kind of your immersion in it. I doubt that shielded you from anything, but kind of like, what was your experience like?
You're muted, Mike.
Oh, thanks.
Sorry.
I would say, when An and Callie was speaking, I was like, yes. Oh my God, I went through that too, right? Even as a daughter of Hmong refugees, I think about just growing up in Meadowview and Oak Park. My family, my parents in particular, and this is the reason why I'm such a big proponent of ethnic studies and Asian American studies, and ethnic studies in particular for our K-12 kids, because had I known about my own history at a young age, I don't think I would have internalized poverty and whiteness the way that I did, right? I think the story that Callie shared and An shared is very similar, because I remember growing up just poor, and there was 2 incidents that was, as a kid, that was really defining for me. As a kid, I didn't really know that, quote unquote, I was different until I always share this incident when I was on the playground. And back in the days when you're allowed to bring junk food to movie nights, a classmate was like, if everyone brings $1 in the next day on the blacktop, I can go to the store with my mom and buy you all chips. So that night I went into my mom's purse, and lessons learned, don't ever steal from your parents. I took $1 out of her purse. And then the next day during recess, all the kids huddled on the blacktop and everyone pulled out their $1. And I pulled out my $1, and there was a pause, and the girl goes, "That's food stamp. You're poor." And all the kids started laughing. And in that moment, I was crying. And I still remember that moment as a 3rd grader, crying and thinking, what? But this is money. This is what mom and dad used to pay for food, right? for me, it was a form of just, it's $1, right? And I remember sitting in the corner of the playground just crying. And I went home and I put that $1 back. My mom was like, in home, like, what are you doing? Why are you going through my purse? And I said, what is this? She said, it's government money to help pay for food, right? And at that age, I internalized it. I was that good, obedient Hmong daughter. I have 15 siblings. I did everything I can to help mom and dad, but I wanted to leave Sacramento. I hate being poor, living in a house full of cockroaches, but these were also lived experience by my neighbors who were Latino, who were Black, right? And I didn't know any of my history. I just wanted to leave Sacramento. And as you know, because Trey, you're a Buck Scholar, I'm a Buck Scholar too. I went to college, and that was when my political awakening really happened, when I took one class in sociology and learned one line about the Hmong people, a history that I should have been taught in my K-12 education. And my parents didn't really share because when I asked my dad, he was like, well, could you never ask? And I'm like, I never asked. It was also a way for my parents not to talk about the war, right? The secret war. They wanted me to be focused on school. And that was when my political awakening really happened. And I became a community organizer on school campuses, really fighting for Asian American studies at the University of San Francisco, because it was a minor during that time. And so that's why I value ethnic studies. And I think, making sure that we teach our young people really the lived struggles, and not just Asian Americans and Pacific Islander, but the Black community, of the Latino community, of indigenous communities in the US. That's so critical, right? I mean, that's where we could really begin. It's really, how do you change the consciousness of a whole generation? That's why I'm so hopeful with our young people, because if anything, I really believe that they're going to be the one leading us into a world. I'm hopeful. I mean, I know we haven't gotten to the conclusion yet, and I'm trying to be hopeful, but I do believe there's a better world for us. If we can really envision it. And that starts with educating our young people of all races and ethnicity, so that they can be conscious about really lived struggles of all communities.
For sure. And I think that, that is we'll get to that at the end. That's the hope of us ever kind of not being in this scenario any longer, and not being under the heel of white supremacy and racism and potential violence in our communities, is that we do band together and we do teach each other our histories. I'm interested because I've talked to a few of my Asian American friends, and there does seem to be, like the reaction to this rising tide of, racism, it does hit different depending on, kind of which community in the API community you're a part of, and kind of what economic status you might be. There was an incident in Irvine this past week where, Irvine has a lot of, a very large API population, many of whom are very economically well off. And there might be a sense that they're insulated, or they've kind of escaped these types of threats. And that there was a gentleman, who was, kind of attacked physically in his own neighborhood, in a neighborhood that's predominantly Asian, in a wealthy neighborhood. And it's kind of like burst this bubble of like, oh, I thought that we were different, And so how can you guys speak to kind of like how this is being, this kind of, how the community is responding? Obviously, we've covered you're not a monolith, but between the kind of our parents' age and maybe our age and the youth, like, how is this being interpreted? I mean,
well, I would say, Trey, I think there's definitely a spectrum of philosophy, right, of even how to move forward. I think one, now that we have kind of garnered I would say the beginning of the consciousness of America, that this is really happening to Asian America, I think that's a great first step. But how we move forward is going to be the challenge too, within our very complex and diverse community. Because even as a current elected official, I will say there are even divisions with how we move forward among quote unquote API leaders, right? A call for more law enforcement, perhaps, which is not my stance, right? Because my call is really about investment in our communities. And so there is, in terms of response and how we move forward, I will say the common ground is there is an acknowledgement that there is harm and trauma that the Asian American community is facing, which is a great first step. But how we move forward is truly going to be the challenge. I think there has been work within the Asian American community to really reckon with these questions and ensure that as we are responding to anti-Asian hate, that we don't create the same systems that we're fighting against and perpetuate anti-Blackness. Because I will say, as an Asian American, I've seen that. It's very real. And I need to call that out as it is. And if I get hate mail, if I get death threats from Asian Americans or members of the Asian community, that's the fight that I'm willing to take, because I will call that out, because I don't tolerate that. Like, you can't address anti-Asian hate when you're also criminalizing Black bodies. That is absolutely harmful to the movement. And so I will use my voice and my body to protect our Black siblings if I need to, right? Because this fight is not just our fight, it's the fight to protect humanity. And so I've been really direct about my position on that in these spaces that have actually led to threats. Even from men, which I know we're going to talk about misogyny and patriarchy and in this conversation as well. But I think really making sure that that's a narrative that I'm able to push. And organizers, I mean, they're the one leading, really. I'm listening to them. They're the one that's really informing how I move forward, because I truly believe that they're the ones with the solution, because what we've been doing as a government, and see, hasn't worked for our communities. It hasn't worked. And even with the incident of the Chinese-owned family, you know, when police was called, you know, they didn't take her case seriously. And I'll say that publicly as well. They didn't deal with a sense of urgency. So why would Asian Americans call police? Right? Why would they do that? Because you haven't done anything for our communities. If anything, it's really up to us to protect each other, and that's really important. So that's the first piece. I mean, that's the space that I've chosen to occupy and to be very vocal about that, because we also see the danger in other narratives that are now entering the space that hurts the movement, and that really hurts humanity overall.
One of the things I was getting, please.
Oh, I was just going to chime in and say, you know, I do think, like Mai was saying, or you were saying, that I think there is a generational divide still about this response, in a sense. You know, I remember the first time I talked to my dad about this last week, and his response was basically kind of like, you know, they're all racist. And I was like, I know, but Dad. And, you know, I have to remember where he's coming from. He came over, and my dad worked for GM. He ended up getting a great job, got laid off when we were in Michigan. That's how we ended up in Buffalo. They transferred him to Buffalo. We did not choose that as a destination. And he is a person who chose, after he got enough seniority to be on first shift, which is like normal day shift, working like a normal human being. He chose to work night shift, going in at 11:30 at night and working till 7:30 in the morning, because of the harassment that he would get for being an Asian man working in that plant. So instead, he literally upended his life for a decade when he could have just been like a normal person working 8 to 5. He did that because it was too much. That's what he was living with. So when I think about, you know, the conversations I have with him and his position on kind of a futility to it all, I have to remember that, because he does come from a different place. And what I try to tell him is that what he's done is given me the luxury of standing up for him and for all of us, right? He's given me the education. He's given me the luxury of being able to leave my job as a trial attorney and come down to Raleigh, North Carolina, to literally make no money working on first generation college student issues, right? That's what I'm doing now in Raleigh, because of what he sacrificed and what he did for us. This is the luxury and the gift that he gave us. But I can't help but be an optimist, because there's a part of me that tries to take a silver lining from the cesspool that was the last 4 years and think that was the thing that made a lot of people who were quiet, who were just trying to get along, who were falling under the complicity of just going along with the model minority myth and trying to be white proximity was good enough, by saying, like, you know what, it's not, and this is real, and they're not looking out for us. They're using us as a wedge, and we need to stand up for us, because they never will. And that, I think, is what has fed what happened with BLM and what happened after George Floyd into now. And now when I look at it, I think, you know, when you look at people that were out in the streets, you see a lot of people that you never have seen walking the streets before. I've been protesting my whole life, and I have never seen that many Asian people out before. I have never seen people bringing their children out like that before. And so I'm optimistic about that in a sense. I think this grows on each other. And you know why they're trying to put their heel down even more is because there's more of us, and the more of us that are rising together that will become the majority. And they realize that the only way for them not to be subsumed by the majority is if they keep us into separate wedges so that we're all minorities.
Right.
And that's what the fear is, right? So and I think, you know what? I think the fact that the elderly Asians are the ones that have really been targeted and attacked, that's, I don't think it's a plan that they're doing that. They're doing that because they're weak and they're cowards, right? That they're going against after our grandparents and grandmothers. But the reality of it is that crosses the socioeconomic lines that we've been talking about. It crosses whether you are Japanese and been here for 6 generations, as opposed to someone who's Filipino and been here 1 generation. It crosses all the lines because they are all of us can picture them as our grandmother or our grandfather just going out and trying to go to the market to get their greens for the day, or going out to have a cup of tea and meet up with their friends. And all of us are seeing that. And that, I think, also triggers something different. It's ignited something different in people that even if they might silently donate $20, instead they're doing something different now. They're going to speak up. They're going to talk about it. They're going to do something, because that, you know, especially with the Asians, don't mess with our grandparents.
You're not messing with 99. You're not doing that, you know? I mean, one thing I will say that's been extremely interesting to observe is, you know, like there was the incident with the woman in San Francisco who was, you know, punched in the face by some random guy. And I think they're close to raising $1 million for this woman. And she's like, I'm not taking a dime of this money. I am putting it straight back into the Asian community to kind of fight racism. And there's been 2 other high profile incidences where these, you know, kind of elderly Asian people have been attacked. And instead of kind of like taking care of themselves, they're like, we're not touching this. I'm not sure if that's a cultural thing about accepting help. Part of me is like, you should take some of that money. But like, I think that the values that are on display that are so community driven is also very interesting and admirable. And there's like a lesson there as well. Callie, do you have anything to add before we kind of move on to what happened in Atlanta?
No, I was actually hoping that Anna and May would be able to speak on it. I don't really have as much context.
About Atlanta?
To your previous question.
Mm-hmm.
Oh yeah. Well, I mean, I think that one of the things that, you know, has been interesting, from the Black community perspective is for so long, there was this, you know, idea that if you went to the right school, you know, weared your hair the right way, that you kind of like achieved a certain level of assimilation and kind of presentableness, respectability, that like you would be, you know, somehow saved from this. And I think that like there's been a lot of tension between like my parents' generation, they're a little older, like people who are like, were raised, you know, watching everyone get murdered, who tried to speak up and are kind of like, well, then let's just kind of do it this way. And there's been so much pushback between kind of, we need to be out there shaking the table. We're not going to ever win if we just keep making white people happy. They're never going to be happy, you know? And I feel like that realization is also kind of, you know, apparent in the Asian community as well. It's like, we got all the good grades, mom, and we went all to the all right schools, and guess what? They're still punching you in the face. And so I think that that's kind of the parallel I'm trying to draw. So I think it's, you know, I'd like to go into Atlanta, which was like such a obvious and horrific kind of galvanizing point for this. Like, it's really, there's so many things to unpack with it. This is why I wanted to kind of assemble, especially an all-female panel, to kind of talk about many of the dynamics that are at play here. Here you have some racist white dude who apparently is like, you know, goes to these massage parlors, claims to have some sort of fascination or obsession, is going on shooting people in these massage parlors, mostly women, saying it's not racist. I mean, there's like every problem at once, you know, somehow represented in this tragedy and this murder. And I just kind of want to talk about kind of like what your reaction to this has been, and how it kind of, how do we parse this incident and kind of use it to illuminate all the issues that are at play? It's a lot. Callie, do you want to take a stab? Like, kind of like, what was your reaction to this? I know, and I'm trying to do this without being triggering because it's so horrific and awful, but it's just, I think that it typifies what's at stake, you know?
Yeah, I mean, and just to add on to that comment is also the sheriff's reaction, which was essentially like, he had a bad day.
You saw my reaction. I mean, it's like, get the F out of here with that.
Wow. And then to your point, May, it's like, of course, like more cops are not better. What are we doing? What are we talking about? It's an illusion of public safety. But I mean, that's a much more detailed thing and an ongoing conversation that carries on from the summer and the murder, again, that happened in Minneapolis with George Floyd. I mean, the events in Atlanta, to your point, there's so many things to unpack. There's the fact that there are low-wage workers. We're talking about protecting the rights of potential sex workers. We're talking about undocumented people potentially. We're talking about women and the fetishization of Asian women, which I've read it's Asian women and Black men that are the most fetishized. And being able to protect those populations, it goes back to what An was saying with looking at the most vulnerable among us and taking them out essentially and targeting them intentionally. It's the response from the sheriff. It's the ongoing violence that has happened in the Asian community since the Kung flu and all of the anti-Asian hate that has started from Trump. I mean, it's no surprise these things are not disconnected. Mm-hmm. And so it's really just the snowballing effect of things. And of course, like we were talking about with the beginning of this conversation, some of the reactions from other communities of sort of like, well, look at what you've done to me. Like, why should I stand up for you? And kind of seeing that tension come to a head personally and professionally, I've seen that. And even here in Minneapolis with, again, just the organizations that are trying to work together and seeing some of that dialogue. So I feel like to me, it is triggering because it's like, I mean, of course, it's triggering for everyone in different ways, but it's also like, this feeling of I'm here. Do you see me? Like, this is so important. And who is listening? And like, who is here? Who are we mobilizing with? Like, who are we really, who's got us right now? And that's something that from an adoptee perspective is like, that is the core wound. You know what I mean? It's like, I'm in a lot of adoptee spaces where several people are saying like, I have white family members who don't get it. Nobody is checking in on me. And also, I'm not accepted by the Asian community, which is something that resonates with me too, which is like, especially being a Korean adoptee, there's a whole history around the adoption industry. Like, mm-hmm. I am a stain on their country. I'm not a pure Korean. I'm not like part of their patriarchy and, you know, within this like bloodline and lineage and ancestral thing that they have a lot of pride in. And so it's like, I'm part of this community because I experienced the world that way. I'm also not fully accepted by them. I don't really fit in with the community I grew up with in my family. Again, like who's got me? Like, what is this right now? And so all of those things, again, are very layered, very complex. And I think they just all really come to a head in this moment. So for that reason, all those reasons and so many more, not to mention just the fact that it's the loss of human life. Like, we're talking about people that were murdered. There were people murdered, yesterday was it, in Boulder? Like, this is a problem. And so any loss of human life, it really just pains me that we can sort of look at it and just be so numb to it and have it be so normalized that we're like, well, another day in America. Like, it just... What you gonna do? What you gonna do? Exactly. And it's like all of these things, it's a lot.
Well, that was a really wonderful way to summarize all of that. I mean, you know, the other detail that I learned recently is that he bought that gun that day.
Right.
You know, it's like,
yeah.
What? You know, so it's like, that's what I mean. It just, you pull a string and it's like all the American problems spill out, you know? Kind of, you know, Anj, I see you raise your hand, or am I?
Yeah, I was going to say, like, Callie did a really great job summing all of that. I think for me, when the incident happened, of the 8 deaths and 6 of them being Asian women, I mean, while I didn't know their names, like, I felt like they were my aunties, you know, or my sisters. And that night, like, all I could think about was just thinking about all my Asian sisters across the US, my family, my aunties, you know, because that could have been them, right? And the fact that there's this disregard of race, and the acts of violence really erases the painful history of what Asian Americans and Asian women and Asian immigrants in particular, Asian women immigrants have faced in this country. Like I was sharing, there is this very long history of misogyny and hypersexualization of Asian American women in this country. I mean, when you just look at one of the very first federal law in this country, the Page Act in 1875, was the first immigration act that prohibited Asian women, in particular Chinese women, in entering the country because they were racializing and stereotyping Asian women as prostitutes. And so this country at that time didn't want Asian folks to reproduce. They saw Asian women as a disease and as a public health concern, which is very connected to COVID-19, right? And the Page Act actually set the foundation for the Chinese Exclusion Act. And it also marked the era of really policing and criminalizing sex work. If you also look at the API, Stop API Hate data, Asian American women were victims, at least in 68% of the incidents that were reported. Asian women report, their incidents are 2.3 times higher than Asian men. And it's not a coincidence. I mean, for Asian women, oftentimes we're targeted and we're killed for just our existence, right? And misogyny, I would say, shares a very alarming common ground with white supremacist ideology. So this hypersexualization of Asian women isn't something that's new. I mean, this country has a history of US imperialism with the expansion of military in the Philippines, in Vietnam, in Asia, demanding women to serve foreign troops, right? These are moments in our history, right, where Asian American women or Asian women, Asian immigrants women continues to be, abused, used, fetishized, hypersexualized. And so the fact that race wasn't even considered was like angered me, right? I wasn't like shocked, but I was like, this is bullshit. This is absolutely bullshit. Like you can't separate those things, right? And I mean, it just showed we have so much more work to go to insert ourselves in the consciousness of America. And folks don't know the history, the long, painful history of the US, right? Because if they did, they would understand how intrinsically tied those things are, the race and the gender piece. So
just one more thing to add on to that is exactly that point around the history of using Asian women as an outlet for white men. Mm-hmm. And that is where all of those stereotypes come from. So I think about the comfort women mm-hmm. and how they were sex workers or like forced into prostitution with sex workers, AKA that this is something that they wanted. That was the justification for using Korean women in this way. Mm-hmm. And just always having to be the outlet for that. This is the continuation of that. And it's so painful. And I know we'll talk about other types of experiences that we've had, but it's like, just one really quickly was I remember being at a VFW and having this guy walk up to me and be like, I know all about women like you. It was just, I wanted to punch him in the face. And that is, again, part of what persists in this country and where that comes from. So it was beautiful the way you laid that out. But I think that's a really important point to consider that also speaks to what's happening today.
I think you guys should both be grateful for being younger. I grew up during the platoon era. So the number of times that I heard while I was out, me love you long time, you love me long time, sucky suck, like that was like just part of the conversation of being out, just going out to a bar, going out for a drink, out with my friends. And okay, no, not me, sorry, all the time. But I wanted to just piggyback on what Mai said, which you said it perfectly, Mai, was our responsibility to insert ourselves in the consciousness of America. And I think that's one of the things that's really come to light for me as I've learned more and understood if I don't know, I had 2 pages in my social studies book about the Vietnam War. I freaking was living during I was in Vietnam during the Vietnam War. And I need to be educated on that, right? And understand more of that. And the idea of America not understanding and valuing the idea of what it means to be Asian in America. That's a voice that we all have to take a role in lifting up ourselves. That's why I appreciate the space, Trey, right? For you to give us the space to talk, and for you to be out there representing in that way a voice and an experience that's different from what has been for the last couple hundred years here. But, I think my initial reaction on Tuesday night, which, you know, Kelly and I ended up having like a raging Zoom sorrow party because we both were like, we can't sleep. And so let's just talk to each other about how we're feeling until 3 a.m, was just how easy it was for everybody, the media, my friends, everybody, to kind of sweep these women into a pile, into a dustbin to the side, and just label them as like sex workers, even though now we know they weren't all, like they were. But the idea that that made them not valid humans, that were worth anybody knowing their story or knowing who they were, or recognizing that they were someone's mother or daughter or sister or any of those things, that they were dismissed because of what they were thought to do, because it didn't fit into any sort of paradigm worth valuing who they were, really, really was upsetting to me. And it goes back to us having that, you know, conversation around how, as Asian Americans, we're not a monolith. And I think it is one of those things that it's a double-edged sword of this celebration of us having a little bit more of a cultural resonance and relevance in things like Crazy Rich Asians or different TV shows that we're so excited to be represented. But even like Fresh Off the Boat, like my family, we watch that show religiously, even though we don't even have a Nielsen box, because I was like, we need to support this show. And I wanted my kids to see Asian people that were just normal, but they were my normal of what I grew up with, not what I grew up with, right? They were middle class, white passing, doing all the things with their little idiosyncratic Asian things. They celebrated Lunar New Year, right? But they were living a very white life. And so when you have that, as we're so happy to have that as our representation, but that's the sole representation that Asians get. And that dismisses everybody else. You know, I was looking at something and it was talking about like the wage gap. And, you know, a Vietnamese American woman is making 63 cents on the dollar as compared to a non-Hispanic white man. But a Chinese or Indian American woman is basically making the equivalent. So we're not the same. We're not the same. And within my own people, we're not the same, but definitely across the spectrum of Asians, we're not the same. But it's weird that it's like acceptable, the good Asians with their almost equal paying jobs. If that had been, what would have happened if it had been like some sort of Asian engineering place or Asian medical facility and they were all doctors? Would they have had names? Would people have cared about their stories? I honestly don't know the answer to that.
I mean, what makes me sad is to say probably, I guess to the extent that they would have had more resources potentially, but it's like, what it said to me is that like, you know, we're not taking this seriously because of who they are. I mean, we didn't even necessarily know initially that these were the workers. It could have been people there to like experience the services. It was just kind of like, it was the deference paid. And this is like why it syncs up so closely with all these other incidences that other communities have faced. It's like, you know, they've apprehended this murderer. He's alive. He gets to explain himself. And the person doing the explaining is like, well, you know, we're just letting you know what he said, you know, just don't take it from me, take it from me. It's like, what are we doing? Like, we're not acting like this guy just murdered a bunch of people. We're explaining.
Step one, he's apprehended alive after he's gone to 3 different locations and is trying to cross the border. He's literally got blood on his hands, and that man is apprehended alive. But then we're going to wholesale just take his story and regurgitate it, parrot it back as the truth. And we're all supposed to accept that. And that's literally what every media outlet did.
Disgusting.
Yeah. And that's why I feel like it would have been the same no matter what, because like the habitualizing of that behavior and that framing is so ingrained in our culture that had it been a bunch of Indian or Chinese women engineers, I think they would have still asked the white guy, what happened? And you're alive. You know, and that's just like what we're supposed to expect. And I think that, you know, I want to be conscious of time, but I think that this is the perfect opportunity to talk about, like, that's why this is it's a opportunity that cannot be squandered. And this is not to minimize things you guys have brought up, that there are there's certainly accountability that can be had in each of these communities about how we have not, or how we have shown up for one another in the past. Certainly there's like internalized racism, there's overt racism between our communities, between all oppressed communities, it's like, that's to be expected because that's the natural outcome of white supremacy in a country where our proximity to whiteness is our ticket to not be murdered. But the jig is up. That's not actually a guarantee in any way. And so I think that, using this as an opportunity to build the type of bridges and build the type of relationships and solidarity, because all that you described of your feelings, hearing Atlanta is like exactly how I felt with Ahmaud Arbery or with Tamir Rice or with any of these, Stephon Clark in Sacramento. Like our ability to identify with one another has never been more acute. And I think that that's why it's so important for this let's not get mucked up in how we could still disagree. We can always disagree and we can always have wedges between us, but they're making it real clear for us that they don't give a fuck about any of us. Mm-hmm. So, I mean, and so I think that like in your mind, kind of what are opportunities that you think can kind of bring together people or kind of have healing, I think. I mean, it's so hard because we're all we have so much PTSD from everything, not just the last year, but from growing up as minorities in this country that we're still unpacking. And now we got to do it in the context of the last 4 years and COVID. And we have to like learn solidarity with communities that we may not have a lot of. I mean, I was an East Asian major in college. I spent 2 summers in China and like taught Mandarin. And I feel like of all the Black people, that exist, like I feel like I have a pretty good idea of what we have in common as human beings. And I think that that's really apparent for anyone who's paying any attention at all. So I think that have there been any examples that you've seen or kind of what would you like to see come out of this? What I don't want to see is a bunch of think pieces about people like saying, tit for tat. This is not a tit for tat situation because I don't care if every single Black person in the country starts to fight for Black freedom. It's not going to win. That's all we do. If Asian people get together and they do it for themselves, they're not going to win. Same with Latinx people, same with First Nation people. But if everyone comes together, then we all win. And like, that's the only way it even happens. So it's almost like we can continue to kind of silo our struggles, but they'll last forever, Well,
and that's where I think one of the silver linings that comes out of the sorrow of last summer is the language of just anti-racism and the idea of it being discussed in that framework as opposed to discrimination against Blacks, because you're right, that puts us into silos and that continues to perpetuate this like construct of the white supremacy, right? Instead, when you're talking about anti-racism, there's 2 things that happen there. One is it unites us in a sense, right? Everybody, even the white people. But then on top of that, I think it also allows for a sense of acknowledgement of you don't have to be perfect to have a voice in this. You can continue working on yourself and still working externally as well. Because it's really hard. I grew up really feeling like I don't have a voice in talking about these other things. Even recently, I was working on something and I WhatsApped one of my friends. I said, I think I'm a POC in BIPOC, but do you think I am? And that's heavy and deep to think as like an Asian American person who has gone through what I'm very aware now is a similar struggle and journey of being other in this America. Am I other enough to be considered POC? Depends on who, what the answer is? Depends on who you ask.
Yeah, I was going to say, there are a lot of
depends on who you ask.
It depends. They'll say that you're not, right? They don't categorize Asian people as
there are definitely people. I decided I am going to call myself that because I have no other home. I have no other home then. I'm not white. I don't have those privileges.
What we go and do has, anointed you BIPOC if that's what it takes, because that is really what the situation is,
Right. But I think that's a real thing. And I think one of the things that it's been a hard thing of how do you step into the conversation as who you are still learning, still growing. And I think one of the good things about the language of anti-racism is the idea that you can do both. You can concurrently work on yourself and learn about how to be better and to forgive yourself for the things that you did to try to just survive, to get by, and not to just sit in shame about who you tried to be. I used to try to stay one step ahead of the racist. So you know what? I made the jokes about my driving. I made the jokes about my math. I made all of those jokes so that nobody else would make those jokes at me. But what was I doing? I was perpetuating it. But what was I really doing? I was just trying to protect myself.
Hoping.
And I have to give myself permission to move beyond that and to know that I've moved to continuing to work on myself with that. And I think that's one of the things, if we can all look inside, unite, but also look inside and see that we really do have more in common than we do that divides us, our experiences of other, guess what? All of us feel other. And if we can really build on that, I think that's a way for us to move forward in this conversation and this fight.
Absolutely.
And
Callie?
like you said, I mean, Trey, the veil is broken, right? Like to your point on, it's like that concept of just trying to survive, we're individually speaking on, and then at scale, it's like Asian communities saying, okay, we have proximity to whiteness. Let's just like, okay, we're good. Let's just stay here. And now it's like, no. Like we all have the same oppressor and they don't give a fuck. They're coming for us. And so I think my response to that, and earlier, it's been a long day, but like when we were talking about the Asian women, in particular, the Atlanta incident, and then just the history, the other thing I wanted to add to that being adopted is that is also specifically around comfort women, the beginning of the adoption industry, which was basically to say that we have all these women who are now getting pregnant. And when I made the comment about being impure, that's literally the mixing of white American soldiers with Asian women. And now we have these children that we don't know what to do with. So therefore, a multi-billion global dollar industry was born to, again, like get rid of essentially the shame for Korean people and the patriarchal society that's like, oh, they don't have our bloodline. Like, we don't want to talk about this. This is not something that's a real thing. And I have friends in Korea who talk now about comfort women and like this sort of being the central issue of the generation, which is like they were forced into prostitution. They weren't sex workers. And so how do you sort of like hold all these pieces and make sure that people are accountable and the voices and experiences of Korean women is held? And I think that's part of what I was holding too, was like that generational trauma, and really learning about it is just like, oh God, it's not just me, it's women who look like me. And also like my grandparents that I've never met and their grandparents. It's like all of these things that a lot of communities of color can really hold and understand this generational trauma. So I think to answer your question of like, what do we sort of do? Where do we go from here? I think it's interesting. And again, my perspective is specific to Minneapolis and it's unique because of everything that's been happening here. So I think that at an organizational level, at a political level, at a legislative level, there is a lot of solidarity. And that feels really good because that's what has to happen. And when I have other interpersonal conversations, when I hear about people's personal experiences that form their opinions, I mean, look, people are people and people are going to be shitty regardless of what their race is. So it's like, I would love to have conversations that there is more space to be able to unpack different parts of our identity and to share more about what our experiences are and see that, like On said, we have more in common than we really do have as differences. But that requires relationship and trust and community. And we have two things working against us right now. One is COVID, right? And the other is just that there's so much fear, I think, to say the wrong thing because we live in a culture that wants to cancel you as soon as you say the wrong thing. And I see that all the time, even online, especially in BIPOC communities, and talking specifically about Minneapolis. So it's like really hard to see that too. But I think if we can like work at that level and then continue to do what we're doing from a systemic institutional perspective, I think we'll be in a good place. The other thing that I'm going to ask everyone to do is like to learn more about the history of some of the things that we've talked about, and also to really complicate your narrative, like really, really, really understand that there is a diversity of people within the Asian community, and that perpetuating that model minority myth and looking specifically at a lot of the successful Eastern Asians that are, doing really well for themselves and making money. Like, look, that's dope, but like, that's not the lived experience of a lot of people. And if you're going to use that as a justification to not give affirmative action to all Asian people, that's a problem. And that's going to further divide our communities. So I think it's really important that we look at how layered and complex this is. And we start to think about also basic human rights, to the point about like, oh, they're sex workers. Well, we potentially just don't care about their story. No. Like talking about militarization and the over policing of our communities. No. All of these things have to come into play too, because they're a dimension of what has happened in Atlanta. So that's another thing that I know we're organizing across communities on, and continue. I think that needs to continue.
Absolutely. I mean, bang, 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 Callie, like all that stuff is like truly, truly crucial and well put. And specific.
Mm-hmm.
Maya, do you have anything?
No, I mean, Callie is hot on the mic. She is absolutely on point. I'm just like nodding my head because I'm like, Callie, you're amazing. And I'm really glad that you're holding it down and doing the work there. So just props to you and on just everything that y'all are doing. I think also knowing that, our fights in our own city, that we're not alone in this, right? And that there are sisters across. It's always, Asian women or our queer and trans folks that are actually leading the movement and doing this work on the ground, that they don't get enough credit. So just mad props to both of you. I think the only thing I would add, is like doing that internal work. And I think I've always asked myself every day in spaces that I'm in and policy decisions that I make, is that the decisions that I'm making, the policy decisions that I'm making, is it going to hurt and harm our communities? I'm always asking myself in spaces like, how am I being anti-racist? Like, what am I doing? Because what I don't want to do in this position is create the same kind of system that I'm trying to fight against. And so I'm always very cognizant of that. And that's why I always lean in and tap into community organizers on the ground, because I truly believe that they have the solutions, because what we've been doing as a government entity hasn't worked. The other piece I would just also share is, what gives me hope is I think about community activists that and leaders that came before me, other Asian American women like Yuri Kochiyama or Grace Lee Bloggs, right? I think it's really important to know that there are folks that have paved the way for this movement for us. And so that, it's not something that we're just, we are continuing the torch, right? Like this work is long, it's hard, it's not a sprint, it's absolutely a marathon, but also that there are leaders that have paved the way for us so that we could be able to do this work. I mean, oftentimes stories of solidarity that have existed have been left out of mainstream media or history book, and that's intentional by white supremacy, right? I mean, Yuri Kochiyama, who worked alongside Malcolm X, or Black Americans who fought for the entry of Southeast Asian refugees after the Vietnam War during the Civil Rights Movement, and even right here in Sacramento after the tragic death of Stephon Clark, there was a unity circle that began with the Black, Latino, and Asian residents and community leaders to really talk about how our struggles are connected and how our liberation are absolutely bound to each other. And so that work continues, right? And I think it goes back to what are ways in which we're using our positions in any space that we're in to insert ourselves into the consciousness of America about, who we are, even our complex narrative, right? The complexity of our community. That's going to be really important. And Callie's absolutely right that you are sensing like a sense of solidarity, at the system level, you're definitely seeing leaders stepping up to the plate to condemn. But also at the same time, we need organizers on the ground to make sure that we hold elected officials accountable, and me included, right? But I will say it is exhausting. I mean, that's why representation is also really important, because it shouldn't just be on me, or at least what folks are telling me now, like it shouldn't just be on me to be saying what needs to be said, right? Like other elected officials in the space who are not Asian Americans need to step up and carry some of this work as well. I am cognizant of the position I occupy, which is the people's seat. It's not my seat. But I really hope that other elected officials who are not Asian Americans will also step up and take lead on helping to lead this fight too. So.
Well, absolutely. I mean, this is, I think it is really important to know that you're not reinventing the wheel, and that this is a really, rich and fruitful and instructive history that we're all part of, and legacy that we're all part of from all of our communities. And they have been, and I think the further back you go, the more people were like, we got to stick together because we're the only ones here. Yeah. And I think that even though all of us have experienced, what happened? Sorry. All of us have experienced, a lot of kind of growth, and we've all kind of seen some barriers fall. This is not going down without a fight. White supremacy is not going down without a fight. And it's going to take everything that we have and every tool in the box and every kind of relationship and bridge we can build. And we were really good at that. We've had to become so resilient and so innovative when it comes to structures of survival and perseverance and equity and cooperation. Like, we invented that, not these kind of horrible systems. So I think that they're less equipped than we are to deal with this. We are the ones who can kind of form community in the face of almost unimaginable struggle and violence. So I hope for us, and I think that, like, unfortunately, it takes really dire circumstances and high stakes to kind of bring us together. But, I'm fully committed. Does anyone have any last words? I mean, for instance, like I've been thinking about what I can do as an ally. Obviously, I'm so thankful and grateful for all of you, Anmai and Callie, for coming on here during an extremely exhaustive time to share your extreme wisdom and experiences. I think it's so valuable. I've signed up for the bystander training next week that I want to say it's called, I can't even remember what the organization is called, but I'll share it when I share this episode. There's trainings you can do. There's places you can donate. Are there any organizations you'd like to especially highlight that you think people should be aware of before we go?
Red Canary Song is one of them. Yeah. There's a couple other organizations that are being lifted up as the ones to be centered right now. I can make sure that you have those, Trey, if you can include those. I think that might be helpful. The last thing that I just wanted to say was that I was reading something that an author had written was essentially, I don't remember who it was, so otherwise I'd quote them and give them credit. I don't remember. But it was like, hope is a discipline. And honestly, it's like kind of disrespectful to give up at this point, because look at everything that has happened before us. And I think, you were saying this to me the other day, is like, if you zoom out, man, there's been so much progress in the last couple of years, in the last couple of months. Like, it does feel dark and deep. And also it's like, we got to get on the balcony and think about everything that has happened before this and all the people that have come before us, and really feel like, all right, if this is the discipline, then what choice do we make today? And how do we make sure that we stick together? And that does give me hope, as well as people like who are raising our next generation of children who are like so incredible. I was having a conversation with another friend, Emily Miner, who was like, I'm teaching my 3-year-old about consent with like, do you want to give me a hug, instead of just like running up and grabbing someone? And I was like, I wouldn't even think about that. That's dope. So yes, I'll send those organizations. And I think those are just my final thoughts, is just hope as a discipline. Like, think about everyone that has come before us.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, well, thank you for this special episode of What We Gonna Do. Lots of work to do. I love you all. Keep it up. Stay safe out there, and just keep it up. We have a long road ahead, but together we'll get there. So take care. And thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thanks for this conversation.
Thank you so much.
Thanks, Trey.